into Romans. We finished up our 2 Timothy passage, and we did another random verse, which it's actually probably, if you're going to understand Romans, this verse, if you're trying to figure out this verse, you've got to understand Romans to kind of figure out this verse. Okay, so we always start with our questions, all right? Just observations tonight, guys, just observations. And if you have questions, this is where we write down, right? We write down our questions. We're not answering questions, we're just observing. Because what happens when you start answering questions before you're done with all your observation? You never actually get through your study because you follow all these squirrels and links, and you're like, what was I studying in, right? So we last week asked the question, because someone read Romans 6:14. We'll just read it again so we have it out there.
For sin shall not have dominion over you, for you are not under the law but under grace.
Okay, so for sin will not have dominion over you, because you are under law, or not under law, but under grace. And so the first question that kind of came up last week, well, what law are we talking about? Right? And so someone said, maybe it's the Ten Commandments. Maybe it's the law of Moses, the entirety of it. Maybe it's law in general, right? Any law, because the law of Moses only incorporates a certain particular people, right? Not all of the world. Maybe it's a civic law, right? Maybe it's the traffic violations. Speed limit says 55, you go 65. You can go 65 because you're not under what? You're not under law, you're under grace, so go ahead and break the speed limit, right? So those are potential questions that come up when you're reading this verse, okay? But we started with the who. Who's writing? We wrote Paul. All right, we found that in chapter 1, verse 1. Who's he writing to? Roman Christians, okay? And what we recognized about these Christians as we were reading chapter 1, these are people he's what? He's never met them. He's heard about them, and he has a desire. What did we say last week? He has a desire to do what? He has a desire to go to Rome. And if you know your historical context, how does Paul actually get to Rome? In chains, right? So he has all these prayers to go to Rome. God's kind of been hindering him and stopping him. And Paul's like, oh, it's going to be God's timing. And he goes in chains, okay, when he eventually gets there. And so that's kind of where we ended last week. We just kind of got into some very basic observation things last week. So we're looking at the what in the first what. So sin not having dominion over you. We're not under law, but we're under grace. So what's our next question we ask? All right, we're just observing right now.
Why? Where?
Oh, yeah. So the where is kind of answered for us. All right, they are in Rome. Which, once again, if you were really wanting to dive deep, you would want to figure out, well, how did Christians get all the way up in Rome? Yeah, they heard the word and traveled. But if you're reading, what book serves as our historical context for the New Testament? That all the other letters are kind of developed within. Acts. Okay, so whenever you're looking for historical context, you want to figure out, you want to go to the book of Acts and see what's been going on in Rome in the book of Acts. Okay? What's been going on in Rome there? And what you discover, there's only one place, besides at the very end, it's Paul ending up in Rome, where there are Christians who are in Rome. What did we talk about last week? Do you remember where Roman Christians are found in the very first beginning of the book of Acts?
Was it the city of Corinth?
Huh?
Was it the city of Corinth, or was it Macedonia?
No, that was from Timothy. Yeah, I know we stopped Timothy, so we were in Timothy and in Romans, so we're kind of jumping ship here, or jumping gears, not ship. So the book of Acts has Rome. The first set of Roman Christians are found in Acts chapter 2 on the day of Pentecost. Okay? Which they're in Jerusalem for a feast at Pentecost, and when it lists all the people who are there, there's a group from Rome there. And so there were Jewish Christians, right? Pentecost is a Jewish festival, right? A Jewish feast, so they're in for a Jewish holiday. Well, they hear the gospel for the first time that Jesus Christ is the Messiah, and so what do they take home with them? We have no record of any other apostle going to Rome, okay, throughout our historical context from Scripture, but also historical context from extra biblical sources, because most of your apostles actually went east and not west. Some down to Egypt, okay? And so when you look, Paul's job was kind of Jerusalem, Asia Minor, and up to Rome. That was kind of like his territory. The other apostles went elsewhere, sometimes with Paul. But anyway, I'm doing some of that work for you, or we'd be here for 4 years just figuring out this, okay? So you can either trust me or back it up, go back it up. But so what we're dealing with is Roman Christians who were there on the day of Pentecost, and now what we discover is a lot of those Christians stayed for several weeks, didn't they? For several weeks, day by day, they were meeting in each other's homes. So when you're reading Acts, those Christians who would normally come in for a feast for a week are like hanging around, and other Christians are selling off property to allow them to stay longer. Okay? But eventually, one of the reasons why Paul has to write a lot of the letters and go and visit, because they can't do that forever, right? You can't, I'm going to say bum off, but I'm going to use that as a very general term, off other people for so long. Eventually, you got to go home. Okay? And so, let's say it was even a month. That would probably be a good time, right? A good time frame of how long they were in. But how much can you learn in a month? Right? You're a new Christian, and you're learning some new stuff. And so, Paul hears of some things that are going on in Rome, and that's why he's writing. And he wants to come up to lay on hands to be able to pass on what? He wants to be able to pass on spiritual gifts. Okay? Which, when you're reading Romans chapter 1, this is a sidebar, but this is a question you got to ask. Why would Paul be needed to pass on a spiritual gift? Like why couldn't they? Why isn't the Spirit just endowing them with gifts, right? Like it happened in Pentecost.
There has to be a mouthpiece to go along with it.
Well, why doesn't he just send someone else? I mean, there are other Christians who are already up there. Well, as you're reading Acts, what you realize is, guess who are the people who are passing on the spiritual gifts? It's one of the roles of the apostles. Okay? Now, we're not going to get into that discussion today, but it's an interesting note that Paul is like, I want to come up so I can give you some of the gifts that other churches are able to experience. And when you look at like the church at Corinth, they've got gifts of faith, right? They got gifts of prophecy. They got gifts of, speaking in tongues. They got all these gifts that are able to aid and help them to understand God's will for them. And Rome seems to just be going off of what they heard for the time that they were in for Pentecost, however long that was. Okay? And we talked about last week in the book of Acts, they already had the Jerusalem Council where they settled a lot of the issues that the church at Rome is dealing with. Okay? A lot of the differences between the Jews and Gentiles. Well, they weren't here for that, obviously. Okay? They weren't here for that. And so as they've been spreading the message of Jesus, they're not just going to, great thing, they're not just going to Jews, they're also bringing in who? Gentiles. Well, whenever you bring two different groups of people in from different backgrounds, what's going to naturally happen? Right? Some tension of beliefs, right? And when you're reading the book of Romans, you are discovering there is definitely some tension between the Jews and the Gentiles. Okay? And that gets really settled in Romans 14:15 in the sense of like the specifics. Okay? But, all right, that's our where. We're in Rome. Okay? So who, what, where, when? When's a good discussion?
57 and 58 AD, sometime in order.
Yeah, and if you have a Bible, it kind of tells you, and there's some different chronologies of when this was. But what we do know It was before what? It was before Paul was in chains, right? Before Paul was imprisoned. Okay? And so if you're doing your Bible study and you know, once again, this is where when you study your Bible, like if you started in Romans, like let's say it's your first book opening up, you're going to struggle real hard. Because Romans, the book of Romans, is based upon and drawing from so many other things that have happened. Okay? That's why when someone tells me, I don't understand why someone just can't open up their Bibles and understand it. That's a big pill to swallow. How many of you have been Christians for years and struggle with understanding, opening up your Bible and understanding what's going on in it? Okay? It can be difficult. So I want us to kind of get rid of those sayings, almost make you feel guilty and shamed. Like, well, how don't you understand it? There's a lot of work that can go into, okay? And there's maybe some basic stuff, right? You can understand a little bit about what this is talking about, can't you? You can get a concept of what's going on, but can you really take this and go too far with it? Right? If you start thinking, hey, this is law in general, and a cop pulls you over, the Bible tells me that I am not under law and I am under grace. I will drive as fast as I want because God gives me permission. There are people who go that far,
God
right?
also said what you hold true on earth, so hold true in heaven. He has his people on earth, so just saying.
Okay. That verse, all right. Yes and no, okay. All right, so before Paul was imprisoned, but it's also after Pentecost, right? It's got to be after Jesus, all right? So we're looking in between. Now, this is just you coming up with some of your own stuff. When was Jesus crucified? Anyone know? What year? 0. That's when he was born.
33 AD.
Okay, anywhere from 29 to 33 AD. I hold that we actually got it wrong, and actually Jesus' birth was probably -4 AD. But that's some information that has come out later. So anyway, 29 to 33 AD, essentially. So he was born, and we know that he lived for 30 years. He was 30 when he started his ministry, and he went ministry about 2.5 to 3.5 years, depending on how many Pentecosts you think, or Passovers you think he actually lived under. So we're about 33 AD. Anyone know when Paul died? Huh? No? I think it's like 60 something, 61, 62. All right, so we're in between here. But here's what I'm trying to get us to understand. We're within 30 years of the death of Jesus, somewhere in there. Okay? It's definitely after 50 because Galatians was probably our first one. All right? So we're looking at probably 20 years after the time of Jesus. Why I find this to be interesting, and these are, once again, I'm trying to get you to think, when you're thinking about these things, you got to be looking at the whole picture. They're struggling with what to believe 20 years after Jesus walked the earth. Do you think we're going to have issues 2,000 years later?
Yeah.
Do you think there's going to be some, right? And the further you get away from it, when you start looking at epistles that are further away from the time of Jesus, it's like the more fractured they have become. Okay? So we've got to kind of take some of that stuff into consideration. All right, but that's when, not necessarily important right here, but it is important for us to understand the when is after Jesus, because if it's before Jesus, this means a whole lot different, doesn't it? Law has changed pre-Christ to post-Christ, hasn't it? Even grace, same concept, but delivered in a certain way. How you deal with sin before Jesus and after Jesus matters, doesn't it? So a lot of times you'll get focused on this, when it's really you only want this so you can discover, are we talking like pre-Jesus, post-Jesus? Are we talking, there's big events like Jerusalem Council. Those are things you kind of want to have in. Is this after Pentecost, before Pentecost, right? Is this before the destruction of Jerusalem or after the destruction of Jerusalem? That doesn't matter as much here, but it will matter in other letters. Depending on what you think Peter's talking about, if you think it's a pre-AD 70 book or a post-AD 70 book, how you view the book of Revelation will matter if you think it's a pre-AD 70 book or a post-AD 70 book, okay? So just those are things, who, what, where, when, and why. So why would Paul have to write, "For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law but under grace"? Why would he have to write that? Why is he writing that?
Direction, encouragement.
Okay, so there's direction, encouragement. Okay, I'll write that down. Direction, encouragement.
Guidance.
Same thing, yeah.
They were bigger on grace than they were on the law. Kind of ignoring the law, but it's just because of the grace, eh?
How do you know?
I think because
Huh?
Well, there's some other things.
So Romans 5, right? The end of Romans 5, Paul has brought up the argument that grace can do what? Look at chapter 5 and look at verse 20. Someone read 5:20. Read it out loud.
The law came in so that the transgression would increase, but where sin increased, grace abounded all the more.
So this is interesting. I'm about to get into interpretation. I got to stop. Okay. Why? So, so law came to do what? To increase sin. Is that what it just said?
I'm pretty sure that he did it in Romans, I think 15, 22, or 23, because there were certain sects of the Jews that were wrongfully judging or persecuting
Yeah, it's Romans 14 and 15, yeah.
the Gentiles, and Paul was there to say, no, this is not how it needs to go.
Yes. Okay, so law came in to increase sin, and then what did grace do? They're same connections. Grace abounds or increases, and it's greater than what? Sin. It's a pretty cool connection. Okay? That's a pretty cool connection. So, I don't need this right now. Okay. So, all right. I'm jumping ahead of myself slightly. Go ahead.
I'm going to ask a question about that. Okay, and it's probably something different. We'd have to go back. Why would they bring law in to increase sin?
That's a good question.
I mean, why would that be? I mean, I know it's the grace can be better, but why was the law brought in to increase sin?
Okay. No. All right. Ready? I'm not answering it yet. That is an extremely important question that the book of Romans deals with. Okay? So, when you start getting stuck in these places and you start having these questions that you just can't answer, you need to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of like Genesis. I'm not telling you to read that. Go back to the beginning of the book of Romans, and you want to start reading all the way through. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a cheat sheet. Okay? So, here is stepbible.org. It's something I've told you I think is a great resource. They do have an app. The app doesn't do this feature though. Okay, so you might need a computer for this. Stepbible.org. So when can you see that? Or do I need to make that font bigger? I'm going to make the font bigger. Some of you can, and some of you will be like, I'm too embarrassed to say that I can't read that.
I'm not embarrassed. I can't.
Okay. Can you read that? Can you read that?
Yes, sir. That's better.
Or I can go bigger.
No, that's fine.
We're good.
Anyone need to go bigger? Just raise your hand. I saw a couple people go, so I'm going to do it, all right? We're going to do it. We're just going to go slightly bigger. There we go. Now, if you can't read that, there's an old person class. No, I'm just kidding.
One word a page.
Yeah, Jesus does heal the blind. All right. Okay, so here's a really cool feature of this. Let's talk about law. Click on it, right? Come over here. It's used 432 times in the Bible. Do you want to go through and read all that? No, probably not. But what you do want to do is click on it. Okay? And it brings up, it starts in, this is all New Testament, by the way. 432 times in the New Testament. Do you think this is an important part of what the New Testament spends a lot of time dealing with? Law? Absolutely. So we're going to go right to Romans. The first place we want to look is how is this word used in Romans? Okay? And so in Romans chapter 2, we're seeing it's used. This is the first time it's being used. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 times just in chapter 2. Do you think Romans chapter 2 would be a good chapter to go read? To see if it's talking about this word law 9 times in this book, to go figure out what's Paul dealing with here? What context of law is he talking about? And I believe you will answer this question when you go do that.
Is this? I noticed that the first however many verses you pulled up, law was capitalized. I thought, or am I just making that up?
In what verse?
Like near the top before you got.
Okay, so
That has to be a distinction. There's no way that that's on accident.
now, okay. So
Ask your why. Why is that?
when it is, this is a translation decision. ESV is a translation decision. They will capitalize law when it is in reference to Old Testament. They will also capitalize the entire word, okay? When they believe it's talking about the law of Moses specifically, they'll capitalize the entire word, L-A-W, when they are quoting from an Old Testament passage. Actually, the NASB does that. So that's actually what you do. It's a format. You go to the beginning of your Bibles. If you have a Bible, a good Bible will tell you its translation process. Why does it capitalize certain words? Why, if you see an italicized word, if you see a bold word, if you see a word all caps, why they chose to do that. Okay? We're not doing that tonight. We're not doing that tonight. You see how study can just take you into like so many worlds?
What is this? What is the lowercase indicating about what is the difference? I mean, we don't have to delve into whether it's important or not, but what is it?
Depending on the translation, okay? Like, see, we got Law of Moses here. When it's the Law of Moses and it's kind of acting as a pronoun in the sense of referring to a something, it's capitalized or Law of Moses. And some translations, once again, it's been a long time since I've read law. When they lowercase it, it's a reference to law in general.
As in like the Jewish law, like the head.
No, just like law.
Like the word civic law.
Like any law. Like commandments. So we are not, all who have sinned under law. What law? Any law will be judged by the law. But once again, when Paul uses, here's how that's why I don't always follow these things. I don't follow headings. I don't look at these things. Remember, a lot of your capitalizations, they're not there in the original language. So you're looking at someone putting them in there, okay? The law, when he says the law, he's usually talking about the law of Moses. When he's talking about the law, okay? But that's a good question. Throw that up there. Why is my translation have capital L versus lowercase l? And I'm sure there's resources out there. I would have to do some more digging and remembering. It's been 10 years since I've even looked at translation theory in the sense of capitalizations, all those things, okay?
So,
Go ahead.
one thing we've talked about in the past is the difference between the audience. Yes, we've identified Roman Christians, but percentage, I guess, Jews versus Gentiles. Who's the major audience here? That'll probably make a difference as well.
Yep. So the major, okay, this is where a good outline helps. Okay? And there are some good resources that have a good outline. There's also a place called the Bible Project. They do like book overviews. Now, I really like their historical ones and Old Testament ones. Some of their New Testament, like, you got to understand, Tim Mackey is a Hebrew, like, his level of Hebrew knowledge and understanding, that's what he went to school for. It's huge. That's why when you listen to his podcast, he's always in where? It's always Old Testament stuff. It's always law stuff. He's rarely in the New Testament because it's not where his strong suit is. And I think it even comes out in his Bible overview videos. Okay? I think that's where his weakest videos are at. Okay? But a good outline will help, because what you discover is chapter 1 is talking about, well, there's the intro. You always have your intro. But then he's going to kind of talk about the entire Gentile world, right? And the way you know that is first by reading chapter 1 and chapter 2. But secondly, he's going to talk about those who gave up God, stopped worshiping the Creator, and started worshiping the creature, okay? And that's going to come up later, where a lot of your Gentiles, a lot of their gods were gods to what? Like the sun, right? The sun god, they had all these gods that were like sky god, sun god, right? Storm god, water god, all these different gods. And so they kind of gave up God, and it shows their natural digression as a society. Then he jumps over into chapter 2 and he says, but you who are under the law, and that's where when you're reading chapter 2, you will see that, right? For when the Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves. So he says, do not have the law. What?
As in they're not Jews.
Well, yeah, but what law? So if law, once again, if lowercase law is reference to law in general, we're not concluding that Gentiles had no law, because earlier he talks about how their conscience became a law unto themselves, right?
Yeah, it's in the same verse.
Oh, even though they do not have a law, they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, and that's...
Their conscience also bears witness.
Oh, right here. Yeah, their conscience bear witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. I just can't read. The font wasn't big enough for me, and I'm 3 feet, from the thing. But so those are good questions, right? But once again, we're still in observation phase. Okay? So if you're observing and you're just, okay, I need to start writing down laws. He's definitely talking the difference between, right? When we're talking about law, he's definitely talking about Gentile versus who? Versus Jew. So what law would separate a Jew and a Gentile? All right? The law of Moses did that. So we know at least that's under discussion somewhere in the book. Just because it's under discussion one place doesn't mean it's under discussion somewhere else. So you got to kind of follow the logic. You understand what I'm saying? So this comes into the why is he writing? Well, he seems to be writing, if you start reading, that where law increased, or law brought sin, and it increased sin, how would it do that, right? You got to ask those questions, which is actually answered in the next chapter, which is always tricky because if you keep reading, Romans chapter 7 tells us exactly how law increased sin.
May I take a stab at that?
Stab it.
I think maybe because the rules made it more strict. And when you narrow this path of law, more people are going to be outside of it, naturally, because it's that much more strict. So if we have this law that reduces the spectrum of living to a very narrow path, it's going to increase sin naturally, because it's harder to live that life
Yep.
of the narrow way. Therefore, because of the increased law, you now have increased sin. Grace also must increase. But not only does it increase, it doubles, or I don't want to say it doubles, but it increases beyond.
Yeah. So the more laws that you put into place, it's kind of like a kid. If you just tell them, let's say you only have one rule in your house, don't hit. Right? They've got one to focus on. But if you say, don't hit, don't go near the stove, right? You're giving them more opportunities to do what? That's to mess up. Right? So the more rules, the more places they have to break it. And that's a good start to that concept. Because the law actually is more than that. Justin, did you have your hand up?
Well, go back. This is kind of sandwiched in between a lot of stuff.
That's why I wanted to do Romans, because this is like thick theology that you can't, if you walk away understanding this verse, your first read through, you're crazy. Okay? You're crazy. Now, you can get an impression of the verse and a slight understanding.
He's walking you through how to understand this. But like what you were just talking about is Romans 4, where there is no law, there is no transgression.
There is no sin, yeah.
So there's something there.
Yep.
With the fact that law brings about sin. Well, in its simplest form, if there is no law, then there is no sin.
If there's no rules, let's say God says, no rules. Could he ever go and say, you broke the rules? There's no rule for me to break, sir. Right? That'd be like a road that had no speed limit sign ever. And the police goes, what you doing? You break. There hasn't been a speed limit sign for 300 miles. Okay?
I think too, if you think about the law, going back to the verse where sin happens up, then you have grace. What's the purpose of grace if there is no law?
That's another good, once again, throw that down. Like what's, right? Grace abounds, increase.
Because then the law is basically establishing this is right, this is wrong. That's what Anthony's saying, like this is the law, here it is, this is how narrow it is. You got to do all of these things. You go back to the very beginning, like you were talking about, like when you originally sinned, Old Testament, like when you sin on this day, you got to take the blood of a female goat, throw it on the left wall, and then rub it down on the right hand wall, and only do this one day a week. And okay, now it's like, okay, so now we're defining how it is, and now we bring in, that's where grace comes in.
Yeah. And that's what you start understanding. Well, what's the relationship between law and sin? Right? And you start, go ahead.
So the original verse that said that law increased sin, what was the verbiage? I want to look at like exactly what that said.
All right, so right here, 5:20. Now the law came in to increase the trespass.
Okay, so why is it worded like that was like what it was trying to do?
It's exactly what it was trying to do.
But I don't understand that. What we just said is that that's what happened naturally, but that doesn't necessarily imply that it came to do that specific law.
Okay, that's a good question to jot down. That's a good question. Like, why in the world would he give us a law to increase our sin?
May I interject? When we have the law, because we have law, and the fact that we have grace, why not sin more? I mean, we're covered. We can say I'm sorry. We can mean we're sorry. But in that moment, we can sin. Just that one time. Not one time. We can just come back 2 times. That 2 times can just come back 15 or 20. But we have grace.
Yep.
So people push.
Yes. And so that's actually his entire discussion in Romans 6. Shall we sin so that grace may abound? Because once again, who wants grace, guys? And who wants an increased level of grace? Well, he just told if you want more grace, go do more sin. That's where it's at. Because once again, and there are people who have a theology that grace covers all sin, therefore I can do all sin. All right, Jennifer.
And what I was just going to say too is sometimes when I look at this,
We are staying here till midnight. Ignore the bell.
well, that we look at it as it's a bad thing. Now, I know sin is bad, but what I'm saying, law are put in place to protect people. So I think God really knew we were going to, go wild and crazy sometimes, and so things were put in place. It's like, why do we say to a kid, "Don't go put your hand on the burner"?
Try and find out.
And because we want our kids to burn themselves, right? And so if they're over there messing around with the stove, they're going to get in trouble.
Let's say for a moment, let's say there was no law. Okay? Let's just say that. And let's say you have a lawless house where you literally tell your kids you can do whatever you want. And the kid comes up and punches brother and sister in the face. What's to stop them? So there's an aspect of that too. Okay.
You said to ignore it.
I did say ignore it. I'm going to break the law. Really? Really? So once again, when you're studying, what I want you to do, and it's very hard to do it by yourself, because when you're by yourself, do you see how a lot of you are being like triggered by what other people are saying, and therefore it's getting you to think of something else? That's why it's really cool to have like a study group where you come together, but don't just read through like 20 verses and go, what'd you guys get out of that? Right? Because, and that's not necessarily bad, right? That's not necessarily bad. But what it does is it ignores a lot of these nuanced things that like read a verse or two and go, okay guys, what's going on? Read a verse. That may take longer, but you're going to really hone in. And there's some verses where it's like, Paul was going to Macedonia, and when he was in Macedonia, he did, you just kind of read through some of that stuff. But when you stop and get a rich verse like this, because how many of you don't want sin to have dominion over you? I want to understand this verse. I don't want sin to have dominion over me. I want to understand this verse because I also don't want to take this where, I'm not under law, baby. Do whatever I want. Sin ain't got nothing on me. Because I don't think that's the impression Paul's going to give as you keep reading. Okay? So what is he stinking talking about? Next time on Dragon Ball Z.